All right, well, you're going there. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. I still remember this day pretty vividly from about a year and a half ago where I was sitting at my desk at the church office, and admittedly for the past few months, maybe 6 months, things hadn't felt quite right in my life. And so as I was sitting there thinking about this stuff, it was just a season of life where daily it seemed like finding motivation to work was a struggle, which had never been the case before. I felt tired all the time, which was weird. I mean, I could sleep 10, 11 hours a night and just wake up ready to go back to bed. And the way I explained it to the people closest to me was it felt like I had a battery that just couldn't get charged up no matter how long it was plugged in. And so if you've ever had that, you have a phone long enough and you charge it up and it lasts a couple of minutes and then you have to charge it again. Just kind of my soul felt like that in that season. And just honestly, I was in this place where it was, I guess I was embarrassed to admit, not just as a pastor, but as a Christian, who was supposed to be experiencing the joy of the Lord, I wasn't. And not just like I wasn't because things were hard, it was a constant, I'm not experiencing the joy and the contentment and the peace that God has for me. And it was, so prolonged, I didn't know what to do. And so I happened to be online just kind of looking at some articles and stuff and somehow ran across this, and you can find this if you still punch this in, but I ran across an article by a guy named Terry Newhoff, who's kind of a pastor to pastors, if you will. And he wrote this article called 9 Signs You're Burning Out. And I thought I'd just check it out for a second. And so he began to describe his experience, and it sounded very similar to mine. And then he gives these 9 signs to look for. And here are the 9. So we'll kind of take this test together right now. Feel free to assess yourself. 9 signs you're burning out. 1, your motivation's faded. 2, your main emotion is numbness. You no longer feel the highs and lows of life. 3, people drain you, which was always true for me, but kind of like more so than usual. Like I felt like it was a little different. 4, little things make you disproportionately angry. You're becoming cynical. Your productivity is dropping. You're self-medicating. You don't laugh anymore. Sleep and time off no longer refuel you. And then he closed this list with these words. If you identify with a few of these signs, you might be tired. If you identify with half, you might be close to the edge. And if you identify with most or all of these, well, you're probably burnt out and you need to get help. And I remember sitting there reading that, kind of tears starting to well up in my eyes, thinking, I think I'm all these things. And sometimes we can make too big of a deal out of what we're experiencing. And so I texted it to my wife and I said, hey, just read this and tell me what you think. And she called me 5 minutes later, tears in her eyes. You're all these things. And so she said, he recommends getting help from someone. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I think it's fine. And so thankfully, I have a wife who cares about me enough to take care of me even when I don't want to take care of myself. And so she went to our elders, and our elders set me down. It was TJ and Joel Kinsey at the time, and said, you have 4 weeks off, and we want you to meet with somebody. And I just kind of threw out there, what if I don't want these 4 weeks off? And TJ very lovingly let me know, you have 4 weeks off, and we're going to preach, and we're going to take care of this, and we want you to go and try and figure this out. And so, things are better now, but I start this sermon with this just to say that as we talk about the issues we're going to talk about now, and so if you had gone through my life, there were some difficult things we had gone through over those past couple of years that contributed to that. But on the whole, I think what I discovered was that here was the main source of the problem of what I was feeling. I had done too much for too long without finding meaningful ways to refresh, rest, and connect with God. Okay? I had just been on this course. I'd done too much for too long without finding ways to rest, refresh, and connect with God. And so for years, I was trying to keep up with the full schedule and the demands of ministry, the demands of others, my own expectations of myself, the expectations others had of me, any urgent requests that came my way. I was going to do something about it because I was the kind of person who could help people and do something about the needs that they had. And I bring all this up to say, as I stand up and preach the next couple of weeks, I'm probably the last person that should be preaching these sermons, okay? I'm learning a lot in this area. I've repented of sin in this area. I want to grow in this area. This is not an area that I have figured out. Or maybe as when I went to my wife and I said, hey, I think we're going to spend a few weeks at City of God preaching on hurry and busyness and stress and all the things that go with it. Her response was, you're going to preach those sermons? And it was, I knew, and she was right. that sometimes one of the things you have to do as a pastor is stand up and speak for God, and speak for God even when you know this is an issue you struggle with, and I'm trying to get better at. And so as we begin to walk through these the next couple of weeks, I preach these sermons as a husband and a father of four and the pastor of a large church who likes to juggle multiple hobbies, and I decided within the last few months to throw a PhD program on top of it all for fun. Maybe I'm not the one who should be preaching. But here's what I'll say. I've learned a lot from a lot of people over the past few months and years. And there's a lot of people who have been speaking life into my life in this area. And so here's what I've done. You're going to hear a lot of books and authors and things that I've found helpful. Don't worry about frantically trying to write those down. If you go to cogchurch.org right now, on the blog page, you don't have to, but later, there's a blog page, and the very first post right now is every book and author I'm about to list in this sermon. Okay, so they're all there, Amazon links, you can go check them out. But I'll point you to those in those directions a lot. So one of the reasons that we decided to preach about this as we've gotten going here in January is simply this. As the pastors at City of God have talked to people more and more, the most common complaint we hear from people isn't, here's this temptation I can't overcome, isn't, here's this massive sin I'm struggling letting go of. It's not any issue like that. The most common complaint we hear from people is this, I'm just so busy. I'm tired. I want to focus more on my relationship with God, but it feels like I don't have enough time. I'm stressed. I need to make it to next week or next month or next semester, the next season of life. I need to make it to when my kids get older, and then I'll finally be able to find some rest. And if you're here this morning feeling anxious or stressed or burdened, you're not alone. That our culture's pace of life epidemic has gotten so bad that mental health professionals are now formally labeling a condition called hurry sickness. And here's three brief summaries they give of this. You have a behavior pattern characterized by continual rushing and anxiousness. A malaise in which a person feels chronically short of time and so tends to perform every task fast and get flushed when encountering any kind of delay. A continuous struggle and unremitting attempt to accomplish or achieve more and more things or participate in more and more events in less and less time. And my guess is a lot of us are resonating with those descriptions right now. And I bring that up to say, if you were with us last week, we talked about a disconnect that many of us feel in the Christian life. We looked at John 20:31. We'll look at that just real quick again, where the Apostle John writes, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And the disconnect we talked about last week was this, that there are many who profess faith in Jesus, but don't seem like they're experiencing the life that John promises here. If you believe, you'll have life. And there are a lot of us that say, I do believe, but I wouldn't say I have life right now. I'm burdened. I'm stressed. This isn't the life that Jesus wants me to experience, or at least I hope it's not. And I want to go further with that and look at another disconnect today that really sets the stage for the next couple of weeks here of sermons we're going to look at. And it's Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. And my guess is a lot of you sense this disconnect as we read these words of Jesus. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So again, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are laboring and heavy laden." The NIV reads, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened," and most of us would probably raise our hands at that. And Jesus offers, "I will give you rest." And I think that's what most of us are looking for right now. If you had the opportunity to stand before God and ask him for one thing, I think rest would be high up on the list of most people. And yet, when we read a passage like this, when we read verses like this, we run into a problem. Jesus says, "Come to me, I'll give you rest." And most of us are probably thinking, I have come to Jesus. I have put my faith in Jesus. I'm following Jesus. But where's this rest that he promised? Why does it seem like, I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do, and yet I'm not experiencing what Jesus promised me I would experience? And here's my guess. As we walk through the next couple of weeks, my guess for most of us is, and I know this was true of me, is that the reason you're experiencing this disconnect is probably unexpected, or it's probably one you haven't been paying attention to. Because again, I don't think it's probably some big, obvious sin that you can't overcome that's keeping you from experiencing this. But as Dallas Willard, a well-known Christian author and philosopher, put it, hurry is the great enemy of the spiritual life in our day. We must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. Corrie ten Boom, an incredible woman who, if you read up on her life, helped persecuted Jews during and after World War II, once wrote, "If the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy." And that for most of us, what we're experiencing and this disconnect we feel from Jesus and the rest that he offers might just be a byproduct of the kind of life we're living, the pace of life we're living, the structure of life that we're living. Pastor John Ortberg once said, "For many of us, the great danger is not that we will renounce our faith. It's that we'll become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied, we will settle for a mediocre version of it. We will just skimp our lives instead of actually living them." Now, maybe you're asking, how in the world is busyness so detrimental to my spiritual life? And if you ask people to identify what's the greatest threat to Christianity right now, busyness and distraction probably not high up on the list. But let's see how that theme impacts what we read here in Matthew 11. Let's go back to this, verses 28 to 30. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, it's easy to focus on verse 28. Come to me, I'll give you rest. But we often miss verse 29. Jesus answers, how? I will give you rest, how? Verse 29, take my yoke upon you. This seems like contradictory statements that Jesus has just made. If you know what a yoke is, it's a tool to get more work done. And so if you were on the farm, you would yoke animals together to multiply their force or multiply their output, and it would keep them at the same pace and working with the same effort. And Jesus seems to be saying, come to me and I will give you rest by giving you this tool to get more work done. Again, there seems like a disconnect even in the advice that Jesus is giving here. And this imagery of taking on the yoke, it would have been well known to Jews in the first century because you regularly read about at this time this idea of taking on the yoke of the law. And so they would talk about this idea of coming under the law and submitting their lives to the law. And taking on the yoke of the law meant guiding all of life and the direction of life that they were moving under the direction of the law that God has given. And Jesus comes to his disciples and says, don't take the yoke of the law upon you, take my yoke upon you. Submit to me, learn from me, live your life by what I'm teaching, live your life by my example, set your course by the direction I'm sending you in. And when Jesus invites us to take his yoke on us, it means listening to his teaching, receiving his teaching, adopting his way of life. And as a church, I feel like we've done good at half of that over 10 years. And part of this is on me. Because I think we've done a good job of championing, or, kind of highlighting, here are the things you should believe. Here's what the gospel teaches. Here's what Jesus teaches. Here's the right thinking we should have about God. All the while maybe missing a little bit that what Jesus calls us to isn't just right doctrine, but following his way of life, following his example. And that maybe for some of us, that's the missing piece in finding this rest that we're seeking. Now, to be clear, there are things in the life of Jesus you shouldn't try and mimic, okay, as you think about the miracles he performed. I remember one day in high school, I was home by myself. You just get bored in high school. And so we had a pool in our backyard, and I remember standing on the edge of the pool saying, Jesus promised us we're going to do these great things. Jesus walked on water, and I spent like 20 minutes praying really hard. I don't know why that God would let me walk out into the middle of the pool, okay? And there's just nothing else to do. So I remember praying hard, and I finally got to the place where I said, God, I do believe this God. And you know what happened? I stepped out and just, I'm glad there wasn't a camera around because I did a complete belly flop into the pool. And it didn't shake my faith or anything, but I realized there's probably things Jesus can do that I can't, and I need to be comfortable with that. Okay? But if we believe Jesus was fully human, he also showed us then what it means to be fully human. And we should look at him as an example to follow. And we should look at how did he live his life. And if Jesus is offering rest, how did Jesus find rest in the course of this life? In John 17:3, he tells his disciples, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent. And Jesus seems to connect finding life with knowing God. Again, like we talked about last week, not knowing things about God, but knowing God. That when you read know in Scripture, often there's this relational component to it, growing in a deepening relationship with God. That is where we find life. And one of the things you see in the life of Jesus, and we could go a lot of different directions here, but one of the things you see is this. What he modeled for his disciples was, regardless of how busy Jesus' life was, and Jesus' life was busy, we're going to talk about that in a second, he prioritized two things, knowing God and spending time with him. Over and over. Richard Foster, in his book, The Celebration of Discipline, teases this out a little bit. When he says, just in the short period of Jesus' ministry that we have recorded in the Gospels, look at how often the Gospel writers highlight for us Jesus withdrawing to be alone with God in the midst of chaos. Before Jesus inaugurated his ministry, he spent 40 days in the desert with God. Before choosing the 12 disciples, he spent an entire night alone in prayer. After an evening where he worked through the night, we're told that he rose while it was still dark and went to a desolate place to pray. When the 12 disciples returned from ministering and they were so busy they couldn't even find time to eat, Jesus didn't invite them to a meal, but he said, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." In Luke 5, we're told that Jesus healed a leper and great crowds were gathering around him, but he would withdraw to desolate places to pray. And on the night before he went to the cross, Jesus brought the disciples to the garden. Why? Come and pray with me a while. And again, we could keep going with examples like this. But what becomes abundantly clear when we look at the life of Jesus is this. Regardless of how busy he was, one of the highest priorities he had was, I need time alone with the Father. And if Jesus needed time alone with the Father to live the life God had given him to live, it probably holds true, we need time alone with the Father. Now, here's my guess what some of you are thinking. Our problem right now is we don't have enough time to add more things to our schedule. We don't have a place. I would love to spend more time with God, but there's nowhere to squeeze it in right now. And again, if we're just talking about adding something to an already overwhelming schedule, I get that that wouldn't be helpful, and in one sense that's true, but these 2 weeks of sermons are kind of going to build on one another. And what I mean by that is this. First, this week, I want to talk about how we can find internal rest. That when you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus was busy, Jesus was in demand, Jesus had a lot of needs to meet. And yet Jesus never seemed to be in a hurry. And there was an internal rest Jesus seemed to have. That even when life was chaotic around him, there was a contentment he lived out of that looks very different than what we live out of right now. And then next week, as we get this settled, like we're going to fix it in a week, but as we get this settled, next week we're going to talk about, okay, there is some things we can do differently schedule-wise and priority-wise and to-do list-wise and looking at what God has for us in that. But here's the thing. If we just spent 2 weeks looking at how to simplify our calendars and to-do list and, paring down the responsibilities that we have, it might change what we're experiencing for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but it's not going to change us long-term. And if we try and unhurry our lives before we unhurry our souls, we're just going to end up back in the same place we were a few weeks ago. And so when we look at the life of Jesus, again, what we see is this. Someone who is busy, someone who is in demand, someone who people were constantly asking for more of his time and more of his abilities and more of his teaching. And if you feel overwhelmed this morning, here's my guess. Jesus was tempted to feel what you're feeling right now. That Jesus was tempted in every way as we were. Okay? And as all this stuff is pressing on him, you know he could have felt the weight of this. And while Jesus might be calling you to a simpler life, although we're going to talk next week about there are some things we could say no to, there are some things we could change. One of the things I really believe Jesus is inviting you into is to find rest in the midst of the chaos of this world. Our chaos is different than Jesus' chaos, but he knows what it's like to have all of these demands on him. And how did Jesus find rest? He found it in time with the Father. He found it in deep relationship with God. He found it in the grace that was supplied in repeated time alone with God. And if we want to experience the rest that Jesus offers, then we have to be willing to follow his example, take on his yoke, listen to his teaching, do what Jesus was willing to do. A big part of the reason that many of us experience the disconnect of, I profess faith in Jesus, but I'm not experiencing this rest, might simply have to do with this. I professed faith in Jesus, but I'm not following his example, so I shouldn't expect to experience what Jesus experienced. We want to adopt his teaching without adopting his way of life. It's hard to admit, but for many of us, and I know this is often true of me, we're simply just too busy to follow Jesus in these ways. How many times have you looked at somebody who's really good at something and thought, I wish I had what they had? A skill that they have, a goal that they've reached, an accomplishment that they've achieved, and to think in your head, I wish I could do that and I wish I could be that. And here's often what's true of most of us. We want what they have without the work that it took to get them to what they have. We want the accomplishment, we want the practice or the skills without the practice. We want the fitness without the weight room. We want the good marriage without the hard work. And in the Christian life, we often want the rest and the joy without the yoke. But that's not what Jesus promised. And so what would it look like for us to begin to prioritize cultivating our relationship with God in the same way that Jesus did? Because if we're being honest, again, if Jesus needed that, it's likely we need it even more. And last week in John 6, we saw this. Jesus' invitation, what? Eat my flesh, drink my blood, be sustained by me, enter into relationship with me. And it's impossible to do that without regular time with him. How good would your marriage be, or how well would you know your spouse if you never talked with them? Wouldn't be a very good marriage. And yet most of us are surprised or even angry when God feels distant. I know I've had moments where I've felt like that. But we made no effort to get close to him. John Mark Comer, in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which I would recommend, writes these words: so many people live without a sense of God's presence throughout the day. We talk about his absence as if it's this great question of theodicy, and I get that. I've been through the dark night of the soul. But could it be that, with a few set exceptions, we're the ones who are absent and not God? We sit around sucked into our phones or TV or to-do list, or oblivious to the God who is around us, within us, even among us, and is more desirous than we are for a relationship. And just that question, is it possible that when God feels distant, it's more on us than it is him? And I think a lot of Christians have made a mistake in recent years, myself included, that as we have highlighted the gospel, the glorious truth, the good news of the gospel, that we are saved entirely by Jesus' grace, entirely by what Jesus has done, that I didn't contribute to my relationship with God, I didn't contribute to my salvation at all, and the reason I'm right with God is the death of Jesus for my sin, his perfect sinless life that he gives me credit for, his resurrection that promises me life after this, that as we've done that, one of the things we've said, but be careful about this, is believing that the good spiritual things that you do contribute to your salvation at all. Because it's easy to begin to think, I'm right with God because I go to church, I read my Bible, I pray, I serve, whatever it might be. And yet we can take that so far that we begin to believe, not only I want to make sure that I don't think these things contribute to my salvation, that actually I just don't need these things. And we miss the privilege that they are, and we miss the gift that they are, and we miss what God wants to do through us in it. We don't have to, going to church or reading our Bible, or those spiritual gifts that God has given us, they don't make us right with God. But because we're right with God, we have the opportunity and the privilege to experience them. And as Donald Whitney wrote in his book, Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life, without exception, the men and women I know who have made the most rapid, consistent, and evident growth in Christ-likeness have been those who develop a daily time of being alone with God. And it seems simple, but I've seen that bear out in my own life. As I've seen the people closest to me, as I've seen the people that I've wanted to emulate their relationship with Jesus. Often it's not because of these profound experiences they're having. It's just they have regular time with God to hear from him, to listen to his voice, to tell him what's on their heart. And it's in that time with God that they become transformed. And so if we want to find the rest that Jesus offers, one of the things we have to commit to as we model the life of Jesus is regular, daily, if we can do it, time with God. And again, if you miss a day, it doesn't mean you're not a Christian anymore. But if we love God and life is found in knowing him, we have to get to know him. And again, I know the objection. I'd love to have time with God. I've told myself this. I don't have the time. I don't have the place to squeeze it in. And like I said, we'll work on some schedule stuff next week. But when, as I was researching for this couple of weeks of sermons, when you read stats like the average American spends 705 hours a year on social media, The average American spends 2,700 hours a year watching TV. Okay? We have more time than we think. It's just, what are we prioritizing? Where do we think we find rest? And here's what I'm often tempted to think. I've been working really hard and I need some rest, so I need some downtime. And we do need downtime, and there's nothing wrong with downtime. But that's not going to fill me up in the way that time alone with my Father can. It's good to have downtime, but downtime does not replenish what has been depleted inside of you by the cares of this life, by your loving others, by your ministering in the same ways that God will. Now, here's the mistake that most of us make. We hear a sermon like this and we say, I'm going to start spending regular time with God. And so you leave this morning thinking, I'm going to go spend 40 days alone with God, just me and Him. And it sounds awesome and spiritual, and you make it like an afternoon and you don't know what to do with the rest of the time and you just kind of give up on it, right? I know I've done that. And so maybe it starts like this. Here's what Donald Whitney recommends. Start by committing 2 minutes a day alone with God. First 2 minutes when you wake up. I'm going to read a verse and I'm going to talk to God about it. And filling up 2 minutes might be difficult at first. But here's my guess. As you regularly do that, maybe a couple verses turns into a chapter. Maybe 2 minutes turns into 15. As you begin to get a taste of what life with God is like, it begins to give you an appetite for more. I had a test I took this week I was stressed out about, and it went well. And the staff was super supportive at City of God. And so they decided to bring a lot of cakes and pies in this week. Now, maybe they were happy for me and these really were gifts for me. I think it was an excuse just to have dessert in the office this week. And so one day it was a pie and one day it was a cake. And I think everybody's had this experience with a cake. You walk by it, and my kids do this all the time. They don't want a whole slice, but they just want a little. And so you get a little icing. You kind of try and find a spot that no one's going to notice it and smooth it over. And you just want that little taste. And 9 times out of 10, you have a little taste of cake. Within 15 minutes, you're sitting down with a slice, right? Because once you have that taste, it's just, I need some more of this. And I think the same thing happens in our time with God. We might not have an appetite for it now, but as you begin to get a taste of it, we can respond in the ways that the psalmist did. Psalm 119, 103, how sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. And a little bit of time with God begins to give us appetite for more. And the way it begins to shape us begins to give us a desire for more. And so plan to find some more quiet just for a few minutes. Don't make it this thing that you can't keep up with. Maybe it's in your car before you go into work. Maybe it's a closet in your house. Maybe it's a room in your office, wherever it might be. Where can I get 2 minutes alone with God every day and see what God begins to do through that? See what God begins to do as you begin to enter into a real relationship with Him. And again, as your appetite grows, that time with Him will probably grow. There's a lot we could say about these kinds of things, but for the sake of time, let me say this. When most of us think of finding rest, we think of time alone, doing nothing, time alone, doing something we enjoy. And the reason most Christians feel weary isn't because they don't have enough downtime. It's that we don't have enough time with Jesus. Okay? What usually happens, we tell ourselves, I can get through this difficult season of work because there's a vacation on the end of it. And we go on the vacation and we feel awesome a couple days in because all the responsibilities are gone. And then we come back and 2 days later, what? We feel worse than we did before because all this stuff has ramped up around us. The stress, the demands, the urgency, it all comes back. And we look at it and say, this can't be the life God intended for us to experience. This can't be the rest that Jesus had in mind. And so it brings us to this place where maybe the rest that Jesus offers is different than the rest that we think it is. Again, it's not the rest of no responsibilities. It's the rest of knowing God in the midst of the responsibilities. And again, as you begin to pursue that alone time with God, here's the other thing we realize. Not only does it draw us closer to Jesus, but that really is the place where we begin to change, where we're transformed. Henry Nouwen, in his classic book, The Way of the Heart, writes, for them, those who practice silence and solitude, it's not a private therapeutic place. Rather, it's the place of conversion, the place where the old self dies and the new self is born, the place where the emergence of the new man and the new woman occurs. And most of us live with a constant busyness, a constant noise, a constant things going on in our life, and it's possible for most of us to go through a day without a quiet moment at all. And some of that we can't get around, but one of the things that Comer goes on to write in his book is that for some of us, the reason we're hesitant to enter into quiet time alone with Jesus is maybe we're a little bit fearful of what we'll find in the silence. The band can come up, but Comer goes on to write in his book these words: all too often our hurry is a sign of something else, something deeper, usually that we're running away from something. Father wounds, childhood trauma, last names, deep insecurity or deficits of self-worth, fear of failure, pathological inability to accept the limitations of our humanity, or simply boredom with the mundane of everyday life. Or we're running to something. Promotions or purchases or experiences or stamps on our passport to the next high, searching in vain for something no earthly experience has to offer, a sense of self-worth and love and acceptance. In the meritocracy of the West, it's easy to feel like we're only as good as our next sales commission or quarterly report or music single or sermon or Instagram post or new toy. So we're constantly out of breath, chasing the ever-elusive wind. And for many of us, silence has this way of confronting us with the uncomfortable truths about who we are, about the things that we're chasing, about the priorities of this life, about our mortality and our insufficiency, about the triviality of some of what we're going after. And yet it's in that silence with God where we begin to see ourselves anew, where we begin to see Him anew, where we begin to experience His grace in a direct way. And as we think about all of these things and to begin to work them into our lives, learning to hear God's voice, to become comfortable with that silence, to learn from Jesus' example, and to pursue time with the Father is not easy. But it's by taking on that yoke. That is the only place we're going to find the rest that we're seeking. And it's a rest that any of us can enter into. The author of Hebrews writes this in Hebrews 4:15 and 16. We don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. If you're stressed, Jesus knows that temptation. But one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Maybe some of what's kept you from pursuing a personal relationship with Jesus is this thought: I'd love to get closer to Jesus. I'm assuming Jesus wants nothing to do with me. And yet, what does the author of Hebrews write here in verse 14 to 16? That because of what Jesus has done, we can draw near with confidence. That regardless of your background, regardless of your sin, regardless of what life has looked like up to this point, as we just talked about, Jesus has done everything to make you right with God. He died on the cross for your sin. He lived the perfect sinless life you couldn't live. He rose from the dead so that you might rise from the dead someday and go and be with God. And as we look at this incredible grace that Jesus has given us, here's the invitation that Jesus has for us today. Everyone can come if they believe in me, if they trust me, if they're willing to take my yoke upon them. Why? Because I've done everything necessary for you to be made right with God. And so you don't have to come with hesitation. You don't have to come with fear. You don't have to come feeling condemned. You don't have to come feeling guilty, but that we can approach a relationship with God with confidence because of what Jesus has done for us. And so that hesitancy to come is wiped away because of what Jesus has done. And now the only thing left for us to do is to come to Jesus, to put down the busyness, the self-importance, the pride, to come and receive and to eat and to drink. And again, if we're willing to finally come to Jesus, here's the promise: you will be filled. You will find rest. That's my prayer for us this year. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank you for this morning and our time together. God, I pray in the coming minutes you would stir in us a desire to know you, to draw close to you. Father, to, in the chaos of this life, have a desire to set aside moments where we can be with our Father and listen to Him and speak to Him and be filled up by your grace. And that we would follow Jesus' example. That we can find rest in the midst of a crazy life. Because you offer us rest and you're ready to give us that rest in you if we're willing to come and receive it. Father, we love you. We ask this all in your Son's name. Amen.